Hello, I'm Daniel Connell from the Crawford School of Public Policy. I'm a researcher in the school, and today I'm talking to Mr. Paul McClintock, who's the retiring chairman of the Council of Australian Government's Reform Council. Paul's been head of the council now for 6 years, and today he's delivering the Sir Roland Wilson Foundation public lecture at the Crawford School. Just to start off, I note that the press release for today's event stressed that there's a very ambitious agenda coming up for COAG, and you feel, according to the press release, that the existing institution isn't up to it, isn't really suited to implementing such an agenda. Well, what is the agenda that you feel is in the forefront?
Sure. It's the combination of the current agenda and the future elements that I think are my main concern. The future elements are the ones that are already on the table. The main elements of that are a national disability scheme, the education reform following the Gonski report. There's still a number of issues around the health reform, which are still in the system. And then some of the much broader issues around things like the Asian Century White Paper. All of them require high level of state and Commonwealth cooperation. And that's the issue, is that the overlap is now sufficiently wide that COAG is really struggling to be the real governor of the process.
When you look back and you think of the national competition policy and how ambitious that policy was, what is it about the new policies that makes them different from the earlier policies that COAG, I'm not sure, do you think that it was successful in implementing that earlier competition agenda?
Yes, I do. But the competition agenda was a very focused agenda. It was relatively narrowly focused. People had a very strong sense of what they were trying to achieve, and they built strong governance around it, and they had a very strong shared view as to what was, where the gains were. But when you start to talk about sort of policies running through health and disability and education, you're dealing with, a very large part of social policy, overall. And that is a much harder agenda to run with the occasional sort of structures that COAG now has.
You've got very large Commonwealth departments in all of those areas. Looking from the outside, it would seem a reasonable argument that their role would be to sort of look after the details of implementing the various major items that you mentioned. But are you talking about something that's more at arm's length from the Commonwealth, perhaps to have it make it look more independent? Or?
Well, I think it's the joint point that needs more resources. I think there's no doubt that both states and Commonwealth have resources of their own, but when you actually see where they work together, where they have to plan together, where they have to actually discern together, that's the area where the level of link and the level of resources is really thin. And of course, I'm also talking about the political joint point as to how much time and how many resources the politicians really put in to working through this very complex work. And I think, again, COAG, in 2 years of the 6 that I've been in this job, COAG met once a year. And that level of sort of uncertainty and irregularity is not a sign of a body that really is on top of such a wide-ranging agenda.
So the sort of changes that you're envisaging would be more frequent meetings and greater resources for the support agencies around COAG. Are they the sorts of things we're talking about?
Well, the COAG Reform Council has to be careful not to start to pronounce policy of its own. So we fall short of actually announcing a model that we think will work better. But the characteristics of a model would really be a careful thought as to how much overlap the system can actually bear. And that really is going back and saying, are we wise to have federal and state governments involved in so many areas of policy? Are we wise to be changing so many of them at once? And only then do you start to look and say, well, if that level of overlap is necessary, and we all agree that this level of ambition is necessary, then you look and say, right, well, are the structures in place to actually drive them effectively, and particularly to oversee what's already been done? Because one of the problems that we've had with the council, and one of the things I talk about in my speech tonight, is that the task of actually overseeing the work that's already been done is very substantial, and COAG has not got the resources and does not put the time in to do that.
But the Commonwealth government departments in all the relevant areas presumably do put a lot of time into that. Are you suggesting that the system might work better from the point of view of the states, might be more acceptable if it wasn't the Commonwealth departments that were, in a sense, overseeing and supervising the implementation of these agreements?
I think obviously some of the oversight is sensibly done at the centre, and that the Commonwealth government should do that. But when you're dealing with agreements between the Commonwealth and sovereign states, and often in areas where the states have got a lot more experience in delivering services than the Commonwealth has, that actually an over-reliance upon the centre doesn't work. And certainly from a political point of view, states are not prepared to have the oversight vested entirely in Commonwealth agencies. I mean, that was the reason why the COAG Reform Council was set up in the first place, because people wanted an independent body that answered to all the governments of Australia to be the main monitoring body under the IGA and the National Reform Agenda.
We talk of cooperative federalism, but there's a very strong element of purchaser-provider and pressure coming from either side in terms of control, and from the other side, a natural desire to, almost perverse desire, to resist control and divert to one's own purposes. Are you suggesting something that perhaps might move away from that coercive element that's hidden behind the cooperative federalism label that we use?
Well, cooperative federalism doesn't necessarily have to be coercive. I mean, in of its nature, it was meant to be, a consensus model, and the things that were agreed were ones that all governments thought were important. And we've seen in things like the seamless national economy, which we have been monitoring in the CRC, some pretty solid work being done in relation to that work. We've had 40 streams of reform under that, and I would guess over 30 of them will land, and will land pretty much on time. So you can actually deliver significant reform if, in fact, you keep everybody in agreement. I think one of the questions really is on the higher level, the national agreements, where we've got health and education and disability, housing, the big ones. We are seeing, I think, a move away from the principles of cooperative federalism, and we are seeing, as you rightly say, a move more towards the Commonwealth, buying services directly from the local. And that really throws up some interesting questions about how accountable the states can sensibly be under that sort of model.
I understand your reticence to actually propose specifics in terms of how the system should change, but if the system is to change, someone has to propose specifics. How do you think it's best done? How do you think detailed proposals for the reform of COAG could evolve? A royal commission, or?
Well, I'm not game to walk onto royal commission territory today, but what I do say is that I call tonight for both academics and the political parties, the stakeholders, to really accept the fact that this is an issue, that the way the federal system works isn't a given, and that we really do need to stand back and decide what we really want to get done through these cooperative systems, and then see whether the structures that we've got in place, are workable, and whether that model emerges out of academia. And I'd be delighted if they did. There are some very good academics that work in this area, or whether it involves the political parties accepting that there needs to be some sort of a national meeting. One thing is clear: it's got to be done between the levels of government. It really can't be imposed either by the states or by the Commonwealth. We've got to actually come to a shared view of this. And then we have to take the community with us, because there's no point in the politicians actually agreeing and nobody actually knows what they've agreed. I think that was partly the problem with the intergovernmental agreement, that this was really an agreement between politicians, which was never really sold to the public. And at the end of the day, it didn't have the political weight to withstand the next attempts to try and change things.
You mentioned the public, and I note that in your speech you discuss a review that's just come out, a survey that's just come out from Griffith University that has quite a lot of dissatisfaction with the existing system. And I think you quote a figure of 30% wanting the states to be abolished. The What is your feeling, having spent 6 years working with government leaders? What's your feeling about the desire for change at that level?
Well, I hope it's growing. I've talked a lot about why there's been such a silence on this area from political leadership at all levels. There are some signs that more politicians, particularly at the state level, are beginning to put this on the table and say that the current system is flawed. Haven't had much from the national politicians yet along those lines. But I think to some extent it suits everybody from a political point of view to leave it in its vague stance, because then accountability gets fudged. No one is accountable. In fact, a senior politician said to me the other night that the only people who really benefit from this sort of confused system are the politicians, because they can really hide their own responsibility by blaming each other. But it really means that the community loses out.
Well, given that, you mentioned academics as a possible source of an alternative view, but it might be they can express ideas, but rarely with a lot of power to get things rolling. The sources of energy for the reform agenda, what do you see? Where do you see them?
Well, it's really got to be the stakeholders. It's been quite interesting, the real energy behind seamless economy, because that's about business deregulation, has been the business community. The BCA particularly has been a real champion of that. And the politicians have known that when our seamless reports come out, they get a lot of press coverage, only from a few papers, but nevertheless in some of the electronic media, the major business groups come in, and it is seen as a bellwether of the effectiveness of their deregulation credentials. So it's given priority and it's given importance. We've got to make sure that other stakeholders take the same view. And if you are a stakeholder in the health area or the disability area, particularly given the ambitions, or the education area, that you see your issue as being not just wholly one about education or health or disability, but you see it as about how the federal system runs. And if we get people to do that, then the politicians would actually see that this has become a national issue and they have to deal with it.
So civil society are effectively you're nominating as a possible source to drive this. Do you want to be? Can you be more specific about where we could look to in that arena?
Well, I mean, you don't have to be, because the topics that are covered by this area cover almost every area of economic and social policy. I mean, most policy issues I've dealt with over the years, there have been some very clearly defined stakeholders. And in Seamless, good example. So you know who they are, you know who's interested. But in the whole area of federal affairs, there is no one Australian that is not affected by how this system works. But the problem is that it is so broad, and the disconnect is there, and therefore, the shock jocks on the radio don't get up in the morning and say it's shocking that the federal system doesn't work. They may say it's shocking that the health system doesn't work, or it's shocking that the disability system doesn't work, but they haven't, and rarely do they make the connection to say there is a structural reason why that's the case. And I think people like ourselves, and certainly people in my position, have got to make that linkage whenever we can and say you can't have a good health policy if you don't have a good federal policy.
Well, I think that's a good point for us to finish this short introduction to what you're going to discuss tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.